Hello and welcome. My name is Hayden Falson from falsonfantasy.com, and today we are going to be looking at camera mapping in Blender 2.8. Hopefully by the end of this tutorial you'll have a strong understanding on how to create a scene like the one that you're seeing now. So let's get started. First off, what is camera mapping exactly? Well, camera mapping is the projection of a picture that is usually broken up onto 3D assets from a certain angle. In most cases, this is from the camera, thus it is called camera mapping or sometimes camera projection. Our first step is to get an image. In the example that I showed you with the mushrooms, I used a free Creative Commons image from pixabay.com. For those of you who do not know what Pixabay is an incredibly useful resource for all artists, especially when generating ideas. Pixabay hosts free CC0 stock images. However, I cannot be sure to validate the integrity of the users who post them, so please use this with a grain of salt. Now I will put a link in the description of the image that I use so that you can follow along to the best of your ability. Please note that to download from pixabay.com at a higher resolution, you will need to have an account. You can use Google to sign up, or you can create an account with them. If you are uncomfortable about signing up, you can try and follow along this tutorial with a lower resolution image. However, camera mapping looks better when the image resolution is of a higher quality. Alternatively, you can take your own image and then follow along using that. Upon downloading our file, we want to navigate to where we have saved it, and then we want to look at its properties, because there are a few properties that we are going to want to remember. So go to Properties, then Details. First off, we want to know the size of the image. As you can see here, I've found my size and I want to remember those numbers. The next important thing is we want to find our focal length of the camera, because we are going to try and match the camera in Blender. So it's really important to do this step. In Blender, we want to select our camera and then we're going to navigate to the object data of the camera. Ensure to keep the type as perspective. We are then going to change our focal length to match the focal length of our image. So in this case, 60mm. Then we're going to go to the Output tab and we're going to change the resolution of our render to match that of our source material, in this case, the mushroom image. We are then going to set up our camera. We're going to hit 1 on our numpad, which is going to set us to our front. And then we're going to press Ctrl-Alt-0. My camera is just a bit off center, but that's an easy fix. We can just select it, press N to bring up our side toolbar, and then we're just going to change our location of our camera manually and just set that to 0 for everything except Y. Let's now go into our camera view mode by pressing 0 on the numpad, and then we're going to check background images and add our image. Now I already had the mushrooms loaded in. As you can see, I have now got the mushrooms as a background image in reference to my camera, which is really important when we're modeling the basic geometry out for this scene. The next step from this would be going into your photo editing software of choice, such as Photoshop, Krita, or GIMP, and then cutting up the image into pieces. This is how I separated the image. I separated it into 3 parts: a hero mushroom that will be in the forefront, the log, and the other mushrooms. However, the 2 mushrooms on the right I will also treat as hero mushrooms in the modeling stage. Because they're so isolated from the other mushrooms that are just going to be UV project onto a plane, it's okay to leave them in that layer because the geometry shouldn't pick up the other data. Because there are so many different ways to achieve this in different softwares, I'll be going over different methods in different softwares in the future. However, in the meantime, I'm just going to show an incredibly quick time lapse of what I did to break up my image in Photoshop. But essentially you want to break them up into main elements. So for example, the log and then a few mushrooms separated. I kept most of the mushrooms connected except for the 3 on the right hand side. But your main tools that you're going to use are your lasso, your clone brush or an equivalent of the clone brush. And yeah, that is essentially it. You want to then export each individual separated layer out into a file format that can read the alpha, such as PNG, and then save them in a directory in which you can have easy access to them. Our next step is to reconstruct the scene in 3D. So we're going to reconstruct the elements that we've already isolated in our photo editing software. So in this case, the log, a few mushrooms, a mushroom plate, and the background. I'm going to be starting off with the log, and I'm only going to be using primitives, and you really want to keep this as simple as you possibly can. So for the log, the obvious choice is a cylinder. And while modeling, I'm going to make sure that I'm always switching to my wireframe mode so I can see through. And as you can see, I want to make sure that the bounds of my models are outside the bounds of my elements. So in this case, I'm really taking care to make sure that the log doesn't bleed out of the area that I'm designating it for it to be projected onto. I'm now going to create some loop cuts by pressing Ctrl R and then scale them so that they sort of line up with the basic flow of the element that I'm creating, in this case the log. You can reselect an entire loop by pressing Alt and then clicking anywhere along the path of the loop. If your geometry is inside the area that the element is going to be, you can always use proportional editing to drag it out, so you can press O, which will enable proportional editing. And then you can just select a vertice and drag it up and use the mouse wheel to change the area of effect. If you don't know what proportional editing is, I have a tutorial that is under 60 seconds just to get you up to speed. So if you would like to watch that first and then come back, by all means please do. I will have the link for that video in the description. For any part of the element that doesn't align to the cylinder or the basic shape that you're modeling, for example, I've got some tufts of moss that come up the top, you can just add another piece of geometry and then connect that piece of geometry with the cylinder. So in this case, I'm going to be using a plane and just lining it up to where those tufts of moss are. So as you can see there, I'm just making sure that the plane is encompassing all of that area and it's in a suitable position on the actual cylinder as to where it would be in the real world. Now with both the cylinder and the other mesh selected, I'm going to press Ctrl J to join those meshes together so they now act as one mesh. So when I go to UV unwrap them, it will also unwrap that little section there as well. Okay, now let's go on to the 3 mushrooms that we'll actually be modeling by hand. So that's those 3 on the right hand side. There are a couple of ways that we could approach this. We could get another cylinder and then extrude it out along the stems and then cap it off with a half sphere. But we could also do something a bit more different and, in my opinion, a bit easier, because that is what we ultimately want to aim for. We always want to make our lives a bit easier. So what I think we should do is that we should generate the stems using a beveled curve. So to start with, we're going to left click, not right click, left click where we want our 3D cursor to be. Now that we have our 3D cursor positioned in 3D space, we can hide our log object just to make the workspace a bit more clean. You can do that by pressing H, and to get it back, Alt H. Because all the mushroom to the left of the first 3 on the right are an entwining mess of tangled stem, I feel that it would be easier, especially for this example, to just project them onto a curved plane. So we're going to make sure that our plane encompasses all of the data that we're going to need. We're going to create a new plane, rotate it, and then we're going to grab it, pressing G, and just scale it up until it covers all the data that we want it to hold. So in this case, all of the mushrooms left of the 3 of the right. To make editing this plane a little easier, we're going to press Ctrl R and create a loop cut in the center. If you can't manipulate your vertexes, it's possible that you're not in vertex edit mode. You can see what type of edit mode you are in via this area here. As you can see, the vertex edit mode is highlighted. And now I can drag individual vertexes so that I can create a nice mask for the data that I'm going to project onto this plane. So bringing back the log with Alt-H, I can now see what the plane looks like in reference to the entire whole. And I can see if there's any points that need to be changed and intersected. As you can see, there is a few places at the bottom of the plane that are clipping into the cylinder. So I need to change this to ensure that I'm getting all the data from the mushrooms. So because we're going to be manipulating this element on a y-axis, we want to make sure that we're able to see both our frontal view and the side view. So we're going to split our window up by dragging out a new window. And then I don't want these toolbars here because I don't need them, I've already got them. So I'm just going to press T and N respectively to get rid of the toolbars. And you can just press those again if you want to reapply them. And your cursor has to be in the window in which you want the toolbars to disappear from. Then we can press the numpad 3 and we'll go into our side view. Now I have my side view and my front view. I can now get to editing these vertices so that they're not clipping through the cylinder. Now that our plane's all finished up and none of the vertices are clipping through the cylinder at the bottom, so that we've ensured that all the data is going to be projected properly onto it, we can now move on to creating the 3 mushrooms on the right hand side of the image. So like before, we're going to put our 3D cursor down, and then instead of making geometry, we're going to make a curve, in this case a Bezier curve. So with my Bezier curve, I want to rotate it so that the curve is facing upwards. It will give me a nice starting position, and then I'm going to control drag it just to drag it up 1 unit so that my point is on the vertice. Now in the object data panel, we're going to switch our fill mode from half to full, and then we're going to go down to the bevel and just increase that depth by a little bit, just so that it's just bleeding outside of our stem. And as you can see, our curve has generated a fairly great piece of topology. Now we can just edit the curve to match the stem. And we're going to do this for each of the 3 stems. So I'm going to quickly fast forward this part now so you can see what I'm doing on the front axis and the side axis. So you can see how I'm editing both of them at the same time to ensure that I'm creating a naturalistic form that is reminiscent of what the stem would actually look like in real life. While editing, if we want to increase the scale of a certain point on the curve, we can do that by pressing Ctrl A. Now that we've finished the first stem, we want to move on to the next stem. So instead of creating a whole new curve and doing that whole process over and over again, what we're going to do instead is we're going to place the 3D cursor on where our next stem is, and then we're just going to duplicate our first stem and then release it by pressing right click. And then we're going to press Shift S and Selection to Cursor. So that will snap our newly created duplicate to the point that we've placed the 3D cursor. And now we'll just repeat the whole process again. Okay, now that we've completed our 3 stems, we're going to create the caps. Now the caps, in basic topology forms, are essentially just half a sphere. So that's what we're going to create. We're going to create a UV sphere, and to make this easier on ourselves, with our sphere selected, we're going to press Ctrl I to inverse the selection. That will select everything other than the sphere. And then we're just going to press H to hide that all. Now we can jump into edit mode by pressing Tab, and then we're going to press Z, so that we can see the vertices on the other side, and it counts that in our selection. I'm going to press A twice, so double tap A, then press B to get our box select tool and just drag that out. and select it. Now we can just delete our vertices by pressing X, then vertices, and now we're left with half sphere. So with our top vertices selected, we're just going to try and match the basic shape of our first mushroom cap. So I'm going to press O to enable proportional editing. And you'll know that proportional editing is on because if I just scroll up my screen here, you'll see that little flashing icon up there. That's our proportional editing icon. And if we click that icon, we actually are given more options. So there is a enabled and a connected option. So connected will only apply the proportional editing to geometry that is connected to the selected piece. So very useful if you have multiple pieces of geometry in the same object. So with our top vertices selected, we're going to press G and then we're going to drag it upwards. Now that circle is the area effect of the proportional editing, and we can affect that area effect by scrolling the mouse wheel. So I'm just going to drag that up. So it's looking like a basic mushroom now. This doesn't match our mushroom exactly, but that's okay. I'm just going to drag up the base by selecting Alt and then selecting that loop and just bring it out a little bit just so it flares out. With our basic shape done, I'm going to go out of edit mode and then I'm going to bring everything back so I can see everything in reference to each other. So Alt H, then I'm going to place a 3D cursor on the first stem and then just Shift S and Selection to Cursor, and we've basically got our mushroom cap fairly well in the right place. Now it's just all about editing and tweaking it in 3D space so it's kind of matching up to where it actually is in the image. So while we've got our mushroom cap selected, we may as well just create the others. So same process, Shift S, Selection to Cursor. Okay, we can see quite clearly that the mushroom caps aren't going to be aligned exactly to the image. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go into each of them individually, and using proportional editing, we're going to drag out the edges so that they match the basic topology of the actual mushroom cap in the image. So we've finally come to the end of the modeling stage, and I would like to end this stage by saying that there is one slight thing that you could do to improve upon this, and that would be to isolate the insides of the 3 mushrooms that we've isolated, because as it stands now, the inside of the mushrooms are going to be projected onto the backside of the sphere. So to make a more accurate projection, we would then have to isolate the image further and create a bit more geometry. But for the purposes of this tutorial and actually learning the skill, that's not relevant as of this moment. Okay, UV unwrapping is going to be a lot more simple than the geometry part. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up each one of our geometries. So let's start with our plane. So tab, then press U to unwrap, and then we're going to project from view. Now when we do this, we want to make sure that we are in the camera view. We can do this by pressing 0 on the numpad or going to view and align view to camera. So now that that's done, let me show you exactly what we've achieved here. So let me open a new window and change that window to a UV image editor. Then I'm going to load in our mushroom image, and then I'm going to change the view type from view to UV edit. Now that has brought up our UV box, and as you can see, it is in the exact place as our outline is in the 3D view. That's because we projected from our view, which in this case was from the camera, and that's where this method derives its name, camera projection or camera mapping. So if we were to just unwrap this normally, this cylinder for example, it would look like that. But if we project it, it now aligns to the geometry that we've already created. Now let's do that for the rest of the geometry. And before we continue on to the next part, I have forgotten quite a crucial step, and that is the background plate. We didn't put a background plate in, so we're just going to create a plane, rotate it, and then drag that back in Y space. So we can drag that back pretty far and then just scale it to make sure that its bounds are in the camera, and then UV unwrap it as we did all the others. Okay, now let's switch to our shading tab, and now we can create our new material. So we're just going to select any one will do first because they're all going to be the same. So let's just select. So the first node that we want to select and bring into our material is an image texture node. So we can find that under texture and then image texture. Alternatively, you can navigate your drives using the panel on the left hand side of the screen and then just drag and drop an image texture of your choice into the node area. So we're going to plug in our image texture into the base color input node of our principled BSDF, and as you can see, there's some pretty harsh geometric shapes on our texture, and we can just easily get rid of that by selecting object and shade smooth. The next two shaders that we're going to add are a transparent BSDF shader and a mix shader. Then we're just going to plug in our transparent BSDF shader into the top input node of our mix shader, and the principled BSDF is going to be in the bottom input node. And then we're going to drag our alpha from our image texture and plug that into the factor. Now, as you can see, there's a really horrible black distortion on our image, and that is where our transparency should be. And the reason that this is showing up is because we haven't actually set up our material to read transparency yet. So that's what we're going to do right now. So we're now going to navigate to our material tab, and under options you're going to see blend mode, and it's set to opaque by default, but we don't want that. We want to set that to alpha clip, or alternatively alpha hashed or alpha blend. I have a video on transparency in the Eevee engine on my channel, so please consider checking that out as I go into more detail as to how this works. And now all that you're going to do is we're going to do the exact same steps except using the appropriate elements that we've already cut out in Photoshop, and we're going to do that for the rest of them. So I'm going to speed this up now. Now, because we're using a principled BSDF shader, the diffuse is going to react to lighting and it's going to create shadows. Now, this is great if we're going to add custom lights into our scene, but if we actually want to use the lighting of the image, even if we bump up the environment lighting to a pure white, we're going to get this really washed out color, and it's not going to look like the image that we have. So if I render this out, we'll see that it's actually quite pale and washed out, so very unsaturated. So if we want to have the correct colors from the image in our projection, we're going to swap out our principled BSDFs with a shadeless material setup. Now, if you don't know already, I have a tutorial on shadeless materials and how to set them up in Cycles and Eevee, so please check that out. I will have a link to that video in the description. But for now, you can see what I'm doing here as I create a shadeless material for this first one, and then you can just replicate that if you wish. And to make my life a little easier, I'm actually grouping them together in a node group. So you can do this by pressing Ctrl G when you have a selection of nodes. And that way I'm able to just copy the node group over to each and every one of the materials. So it's just a quicker setup. Feel free to pause the video at any time so that you can follow the reference along, or check out my other video on shadeless materials. And there we have it. We have the colors from the original image. So let me just put that original image up on screen now. And here's the render. Pretty much identical, and it's in 3D. It's a really awesome effect. I hope you've really enjoyed and learnt many skills in this tutorial. You can now animate the camera and create a scene like this. If you've enjoyed this tutorial or have learned something new, please hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell. Thank you so much. This is Hayden Falzon from falzonfantasy.com, signing off.